I would like to explore the subject of joy. Joy, extreme happiness, extreme pleasure, a feeling of being connected so much with the beautiful inner spirit inside of ourselves. Thrill in feeling this connection and satisfaction. It's like the most wonderful feeling. I was thinking about this subject from two different angles. First, or I don't know which I should share, the good or the bad first, the real or the artificial, the fake first. Maybe I'll share the fake first. I remember hearing that word joy when I was a very young child because my grandfather, who had been a psychology professor, he retired right around the time I was born, but continued being a therapist. He always was having affairs. He had girlfriends, and his final girlfriend, who lasted in his life for decades, well, she was one of his psychotherapy clients. I was going to say former therapy clients, but when their relationship started, he was still her therapist, and he was still married to his wife right to the end, and his girlfriend was there in the house a lot, all the time, and he transitioned to becoming a sculptor. He sort of transitioned out of psychology into being an artist. And his model, was, guess what, none other than his girlfriend. And he went from her paying him for psychotherapy to him paying her for nude modeling. And the reason I call this to mind, this subject of joy to mind now, is because throughout my childhood, one of his biggest sculptures that he loved the most was a sculpture of his girlfriend that was literally right outside the door of his bedroom that he shared with his wife, with my grandmother. A sculpture of his girlfriend standing nude and tall. And he called that sculpture Joy. So that was my first association with joy as a child. Was that joy? I think it was more like horror, humiliation, shame, violation, and that's what was called joy. And my parents brought me every year to this environment to see this treachery, this hypocrisy, this shame, and this betrayal, this misuse of life, this misuse of his former therapy client, misuse of his wife, everything, and misuse of art. And that's what I associated joy with as a child, which is probably why I never used the word joy as a child, because this for me was not joy. Even as a little boy, I didn't like that sculpture. I didn't like what I saw. I didn't like seeing my grandmother get drunk all the time whenever this girlfriend came over and had dinner with all of us. I didn't like seeing my mother get drunk and really drunk when she watched this whole dynamic play out, and my father get angry and upset and then shut down, and watching my mother say, "Oh, I love your sculpture, Dad," when she would look at his sculptures of his nude girlfriend, because my mother was so dissociated that she actually thought his sculptures were good and taught me that his sculptures were good. Joy? Joy? Where was the joy in this? This was misery. And yet, I got away from all this. I broke away from the family system. I started outing the lies, speaking out about the lies, getting hated for it, getting rejected when I spoke out about this to my grandfather, to my mother, to my father, to my grandfather's girlfriend, to my grandmother. Even my grandmother defended my grandfather when I spoke out about the horror of what I was observing. This is in my early 20s. But through this speaking out, not just to them, but in my own mind, about who I had become, about where I came from, I started healing. And that's what I really want to talk about. Because when I really started loving myself, finding myself, being true to myself, honoring myself, and honoring the people around me, honoring life, honoring truth, honoring growth, honoring healing, honoring exploration, honoring true curiosity, honoring adventure, I started to experience joy. I have some photographs of me in a state of joy Am I in a state of joy right now? Well, I wouldn't exactly say joy. I'm in a state of satisfaction, a little bit of anxiety for talking about these things so openly. I could fake joy. Hey, I feel joy. I don't feel joy right now, but I have some photographs of me feeling joy. I was just looking through all these photographs of my most recent travels, spending 5 months in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. And I felt joy a lot on those travels, but I rarely have photographs of it, but I did snap a few selfies of myself feeling joy. And all of them fall into a certain pattern that I have. The pattern is I accomplished something. I had a vision, a dream. Like I spent a whole day hitchhiking in southern Armenia, trying to get to a town that was pretty difficult to get to. A town where there was a beautiful hot spring, I'd heard. You had to do a lot of hiking to get down to it and do some real climbing to get down to it. But I made it. I spent all day hitchhiking from the border of Iran to this really remote town. And it was freezing. And I had to hitchhike with truck drivers and really do a lot of walking and hiking, and my bag was heavy, but I made it. When I arrived, I felt joy, the joy of accomplishment and satisfaction, and that feeling like all these people who said it's too difficult, you can't make it, it's too dangerous, blah, 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 blah. You'll get stuck at night, you'll freeze. I made it, and I felt great. It was like more than just that I'd made it too. It was like all the voices in my head from my childhood. You'll never amount to anything. You'll never make it. And you'll just be an average person at best if you're lucky. And nobody likes you and all this stuff. It was like, no, I love myself. I have fought for myself. And here I am, and I've accomplished my mission for the day that is a metaphor for the greater mission of my life. And then I hitchhiked to another town, another very remote town, and I hitchhiked through the snow and through the mountains, and I made it to this little village where there were lots of hot springs. I love hot springs. And I made it to this very remote hot spring that becomes, once every 7 minutes, a geyser that erupts, and you can get into it, and you're allowed to get into it, and it's not too hot, and it erupts every 7 minutes. And I have photographs of me sitting in this geyser as it's beginning to erupt. And it happened, and it was below freezing outside. I was literally freezing in the air, and I got inside of it, and it's warm. And I was sitting in there and feeling joy. And I managed to hold my camera far enough away that it didn't get splashed and wet, and I took pictures of myself feeling thrill, joy. I've accomplished it. I'm here. I'm alone. I love life. I love myself. I made it out of my family. I made it out of my traumas. I made it out of the prisons that held me captive. And now I reflect on my grandfather, that he was so twisted that he would call his art project of his naked former psychotherapy client who became his sex partner, that he put this sculpture outside of his bedroom window so that every morning his wife, my grandmother, would see this representation of betrayal and horror and violation, that he would call this joy, and that this was his conception of joy. What a lost, confused person. And in a way, I think this is a representation of the confusion and lostness of our world, where so many people, the only joy they know is when they're acting out behavior, acting out their own traumas, addictive behavior, harming others, violation, into drugged, altered states. I think my grandfather was drunk a lot. He was probably high on marijuana a lot with his girlfriend. That's what I've heard since. Was that joy? No. Is so much of the world's comfort and pleasure joy? From what I've observed, no. And so I share these two poles of joy. The fake joy of shutdown, acting out, trauma, sex, violation, misery, and the joy of being self-possessed, self-actualized, accomplishing something, fighting for something, taking an adventurous risk, that worked out and struggling and making it and manifesting and feeling great as the result of that.